Everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Crusades from the Muslim perspective by kings and generals. This is part of their series on the First Crusade, which is ongoing, and I will continue to watch those videos as they're released. But today we're watching this one, and the next time we react to this series we'll be watching Crusades from the Byzantine perspective. I like that they're showing us different perspectives on the Crusades because there's really no one objective view of history. There are lots of different perspectives, and to sort of come to the truth, or at least as close to the truth as we can manage, we sort of have to look at different perspectives and viewpoints on history, and take different things from different versions. There will always be biases in each version of history we look at, and we have our own biases, but we sort of go through different sources and different viewpoints to see if we can get as close to possible as, an objective truth. If you guys enjoy this reaction, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below and has exclusive reaction content. And without any further ado, let's get into this video.
The Crusades are a series of religious wars launched by the medieval Christian European kingdoms against the Muslim states of the Middle East with an aim to gain Jerusalem for the Christian realm. Much has been written about the Crusades, many videos have been made on this topic, but most of them share the same shortcoming. The majority of mainstream accounts of the Crusades are extremely Eurocentric.
Right. And I'll speak for myself on this one. I don't want to group everybody in, but as someone who grew up in the United Kingdom and the United States, a lot of the education I received on the Crusades, though I didn't learn much about the Crusades in school, but a lot of the media I was exposed to on the Crusades was definitely from sort of a Western perspective. I'd say a Western Christian European perspective. My education in general was from a very Western American European perspective. And so that's why, like I mentioned in the intro, I appreciate that kings and generals would do videos like this where, people like myself who have seen these events from one perspective are getting exposed to sources and ideas that come from a different perspective because, we need to be exposed to those to sort of come to the truth. And not to say that, a Western perspective or a Christian European perspective on the Crusades is invalid or something. No, I'm sure there are truths to be taken from that perspective as well, but we should look at historical events from, sort of a broad viewpoint, taking in all that we can. And so, yeah, I'm excited to get into this video.
As often, only Christian European perspectives on this process are being described. In this video, we're going to talk about the perspective of Muslim chroniclers on the Crusades and their views on the medieval Europeans in general. Thankfully, you don't need to go to war to get...
Alright, you guys know the deal. Go and check out this video by Kings and Generals. I will have it linked in the description. Go and check out their sponsor, which they will have linked in the description of their video. Go give them a like. Basically, go show them some support for creating these fantastic videos that we react to. They always do a great job.
80% off. Support our channel and become a lord or lady today. Go to establishtitles.com/generals or...
Alright, there's their code, so you can use that to support them.
Click the link in the description and use the code GENERALS to get 10% off. While the Muslim and Christian states have warred throughout the medieval era, there was not that much contact between these two civilizations. The centers of the respective civilizations were far from each other, and the more regular contacts were only in the peripheries, the Iberian Peninsula, Mediterranean islands, and Anatolia.
Yeah, I think, that's a point worth making because, like they mentioned, the centers of both civilizations were pretty far away from each other. The center of the Islamic world was, I think, pretty deep into the Middle East, whereas the center of Europe was, I suppose, in Central and Western Europe. Of course, that's if you accept the nomenclature of, European civilization. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated and diverse than that. And so the interactions between these two civilizations would have been mainly at the periphery, at the frontier. And mainly, as they're showing, I think, with the clashes here, mainly through warfare. Violent conflict was mainly how these two civilizations interacted. And that's important because that's obviously going to shape how they look at each other. When we look at primary sources from Europeans talking about Muslims or Muslims talking about Christian Europeans, obviously how they think of each other will be deeply shaped by how they interact with each other. So yeah, that's definitely important to keep in mind.
And most of these contacts contained military conflict.
Right.
This enabled both sides to have a stereotypical view of each other.
Of course.
Medieval Muslims thought of their contemporary Europeans as savage, warlike barbarians who lacked any sense of hygiene and were backwards in their development. Europe was thought of as a cold, dark, and misty place. At the time, the Islamic world was much bigger, wealthier, and more scientifically developed.
Yeah, and this is another important point to make. I suspect that a lot of you will already know this since you're probably familiar with the history, but I think for a lot of people who are less familiar with European and world history, the idea that at one point Europe was not a global superpower but was closer to a global backwater is surprising to a lot of people. Because, like I mentioned, for a lot of people who grow up in the West, including myself, our education is pretty Eurocentric, very much focused on the West, however you want to define that. And there's kind of this, implicit idea that, Europe is number one, until America comes along, at least if you're an American like myself. And they kind of fill that number one spot, they lead the world, and that's kind of how it is. But that is not at all always how it has been. In fact, for most of history, that has not even been close to true. There have been many dominant civilizations throughout the world. The Muslim civilization is one. We can talk about China. There's lots of examples that many of us aren't really exposed to. But even if you're not familiar with global history that closely, which, for example, I'm not. I focus on American and European history. I think it is worthwhile to keep in mind that, even if Europe and America, or the Western world, right, have sort of dominated for the last couple hundred years, though that may come to change sometime soon, that was not always the case, and it probably will not always be the case.
Major cities of the Islamic world, like Baghdad, hosted hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, while European cities like Paris and London would have had around 20,000 people each.
Right.
This probably only increased the condescension of Muslim chroniclers writing about the medieval Europeans before and during the Crusades. But the Islamic world was politically divided. The Abbasid Caliphate was well past its prime, and on the eve of the First Crusade it had become a mere figurehead. Centralized power had weakened, and many small clans based on family ties thrived throughout Syria and Palestine. The Shia Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled over Egypt at the start of the Crusades, was also on the decline on the eve of the First Crusade and had its own fair share of problems.
See, and this is where my ignorance comes in that, I'm obviously aware of Muslim history to a certain extent, but, I've had no formal education on it, maybe a little bit, nor have I been exposed to a lot of media on this kind of history, so I'm just so unaware of, the different countries, the different kingdoms, different empires that sprung up throughout, the Middle East, North Africa, Southeastern Europe, a lot of different places, Asia, during Muslim expansion. Even though I know it's extremely complicated, I'm just so unfamiliar with it. So, for me, that is definitely an area in which my knowledge is severely lacking.
The power on the rise in the Middle East were the Seljuk Turks. By the mid-11th century, they governed over the Abbasid Caliphate in everything but name, and established the Rum Sultanate of Seljuk in Anatolia from formerly Byzantine territories. Right on the eve of the Crusader invasion, the Islamic world had become subject to losses of its main political leaders. In 1092, the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadi, and the Seljuk Sultan Makshah died. 2
Wow.
years later, the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir died, along with his vizier Badr al-Jamali. Such losses only worsened the disarray in the Islamic world and made the daunting task of the Crusaders to conquer Jerusalem more realistic. According to mainstream historiography, the era of the Crusades started with the call of Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095 to rise up and save Jerusalem from Muslims and protect Constantinople. The First Crusade was successful in regaining Western Anatolia for the Byzantine Empire, and most importantly, in the capture of Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, and other territories in the Levant, which eventually led to the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the counties of Tripoli and Edessa, and the Principality of Antioch. The Second Crusade was a failure. It started as a reaction to the fall of the county of Edessa, as French and German armies headed by their kings moved into Anatolia, where they were destroyed by the Seljuks.
Yeah, once again, the Crusades is definitely not my area of expertise, though I broadly know how some of them go. I've been learning a lot watching this series. We sort of, right there in this video, covered the end of the First Crusade going into the Second, and at least what I've heard of the Crusades is that the first one found some success, and that seems to be corroborated by what they showed here, but the following Crusades were generally unsuccessful. That's at least what I've heard of the Crusades, and I guess we'll see if that pans out, at least in what we're seeing here.
The remainder of the Crusaders' force perished during and after the failed siege of Damascus.
Okay.
The failure of the Second Crusade ultimately led to the Muslim forces, commanded by Saladin Ayyubid, regaining Jerusalem, which became the key factor behind the mobilization for the Third Crusade. This time, the Crusaders were more successful, as some of the iconic medieval European...
I do know that Saladin is a very famous historical figure. A lot of people, I think, are very much into him and his exploits, but once again, I know literally nothing about him. I'm sure there's some great videos about him perhaps on YouTube. Maybe some of you could recommend videos to watch on Saladin, because I'm familiar with the name, and I'm familiar that a lot of people really like him.
monarchs like Frederick Barbarossa and Richard the Lionheart played an important role in it.
More familiar names.
Managed to regain major parts of the Levant and captured Acre, but the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, was protected by Saladin. The Treaty of Jaffa was signed between Richard and Saladin in 1192, which recognized Saladin's control over Jerusalem, who pledged to allow unarmed Christian pilgrims and merchants to visit the Holy City. The following Crusades did not do much better to alter the status quo in the Levant. The original purpose of the Crusades was forgotten, so much that instead of attacking Jerusalem, at one point the Crusader army got meddled in internal Byzantine affairs and captured Constantinople, inflicting an immense blow on the Eastern Roman Empire at the time, when it was struggling to contain the ever-increasing Turkic threat.
Wow.
In 1291, the Mamluks of Egypt destroyed the remnants of the Crusader states in the Levant, putting an end to the crusading period from the European perspective. The view of the Muslim world on Crusades significantly differs from the Christian sources.
Okay.
First of all, Muslims did not see the Crusades as a process starting after the speech of Pope Urban in 1095, but rather as a continuation of the Christian or Frankish aggression on Muslim lands from the Iberian Peninsula to Sicily.
That's interesting. Although I do see how that would make sense, because for the Europeans, a lot of these other efforts that were being shown right now would have been more localized, Reconquista was not necessarily an effort from all of Europe, and so, Europeans across the continent wouldn't necessarily have thought of it in that way. But for the Muslims, all they're seeing is that in all these different places, they're being attacked and their territories being encroached upon by Europeans, different types of Europeans, but European Christians. And so that definitely makes sense how they would sort of group all that together, whereas the Europeans would see them as separate, because for them, the Crusades was sort of the first time when they really all came together as a unified force and attacked the Muslims, pushed back. So that's a really interesting difference in perspective, but it does make sense.
Similarly, for Muslims, the Frankish aggression did not end with the fall of Acre in 1291, but continued throughout the medieval era, with events like the Reconquista, arguably all the way until the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a state powerful enough to protect the Islamic realm. It is notable that the Muslims of the Levant, who were at the receiving end of the First Crusade, at first thought of the invaders as another mercenary army sent by the Byzantines to plunder their lands. Only after understanding that this time the threat was coming from Europe, the Arab chroniclers started referring to the crusading armies as Franks. One of the first Muslim chroniclers to write about the Crusades was a legal scholar and a preacher at the Great Mosque of Damascus, Ali ibn Tahir al-Salami. 6 years after the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem, he presented his account of the Crusader attack in his book, Kitab al-Jihad, the Book of Holy War, which became an important part of medieval Islamic historiography. Al-Salami saw the First Crusade as a continuation of the Christian aggression on the Islamic world, which started with the Norman conquest of Sicily, then continued in Spain, and finally arrived in the Levant.
I do wonder how, at this point, Muslim scholars would have viewed, for example, the Byzantine Empire, because, once upon a time, it had been the ruler of a lot of this territory that they are now ruling over. And obviously, in many ways, it still held the mantle of the Roman Empire, even though it had been very much weakened over the years. So I'd be curious to hear whether these Muslim scholars still held some degree of respect for that tradition, for the history of the Roman Empire, or if they saw it for sort of the weak, declining state that it was, and perhaps felt like, they would be the ones to take its place, because I know that, for example, that's in many ways how the Ottomans felt. The Ottomans did recognize the history, but they felt that, they would conquer the Byzantine Empire and they would be the heirs to the Roman legacy. Of course, that's a couple hundred years later. So I do wonder what the sort of perspective was at this point.
A host of Franks swooped down upon the island of Sicily at a time of division and dissension, and likewise they took possession of town after town in Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus. When reports mutually confirmed the condition of this country, Syria, namely the disagreements of its lords, the discord of its leading men, coupled with its disorder and disarray, they acted upon their decision and set out for Syria, and Jerusalem was the chief object of their desires. They continued zealously in the holy war, jihad, against the Muslims, until they made themselves rulers of lands beyond their wildest dreams. Ibn al-Qalanisi, a chronicler from Damascus, was 23 when the Franks arrived in the Levant. He wrote from first-hand experience about the hardships brought by the First and Second Crusades. Most of al-Qalanisi's writing is the narration of events that happened in this period, but we also see some observations he made about the Crusaders. He recognized their prowess on the battlefield. He spoke of fear imposed on many Muslims by heavy armored mounted Frankish knights.
Yeah, I imagine that would be quite a sight. The Europeans were known for their heavily armored knights, their heavily armored cavalry, which I don't know if that was entirely unique to them, but was definitely less frequent in other areas of the world. For example, horse archers were more popular in the Middle East and out east in general, and they would be more lightly armored. Perhaps the Muslims also had heavy cavalry at this point. I'm unaware, but I imagine if you are, a Muslim troop or a civilian, the sight of these heavily armored crusaders riding in has got to be pretty intimidating. That's quite a sight.
Al-Qalanisi spoke of the Crusader victory over the Seljuks, describing fear caused by it in the Islamic camp. This event, so shameful for Islam, became known. There was a real panic. Dread and anxiety swelled to enormous proportions. In general, Al-Qalanisi played an important role in reshaping the Crusader Frankish stereotype of powerful but savage warriors who would often commit atrocities, which would continue to impact the writing of future chroniclers. Usama ibn Munkid is another notable chronicler of the Crusades. This illustrious man was born at the start of the crusading movement and lived a very eventful 93 years, acting in close aid of different Muslim dynasties and leaders, including Saladin Ayyubid, a poet, a diplomat, a warrior.
Accomplished.
Ibn Munkid both fought the Crusaders and befriended some of their leaders. He maintained the general view of the medieval Christian Europeans held by the Muslims, which was lack of refinement, low intelligence and savagery. Ibn Munkid was critical of medical treatment used by Europeans, but like many other contemporary Arab chroniclers, he recognized their military capabilities. All those who were well informed about the Frank saw them as beasts, superior in courage and fighting ardor, but nothing else.
You know, it's interesting, you know, when you think about European domination of the rest of the world, you know, military conquest always comes first. Oftentimes, technology and technological progress comes after, but seemingly this sort of military power is at the forefront. I mean, this is definitely true for example, the conquest of the New World, which the Americas, which is one of the things that really started to make Europe a very powerful continent. And it's sort of true here. I mean, these Muslim scholars, they're noting that, you know, the Muslim world, the Eastern world, is more advanced scientifically and medically, which I do believe was true at the time. You know, in the Middle East and the East in general, China, India, were pretty scientifically advanced, more so than Europe, but they are also recognizing the military prowess of the Europeans, which I think that was one thing that Europe often had over the rest of the world was, you know, they were quite militarily successful, and that would do them well in their conquest of the rest of the world. So I think that's an important, an interesting sort of note, you know, a long-standing trend that we can see throughout Europe's rise to dominance and colonization of the rest of the world.
Just as animals are superior in strength and aggression, Franks, God curse them, are the most cautious of all men in war. God curse them was a common phrase of reference to the Crusaders by the Muslim chroniclers. Usama ibn Munkid had first-hand experience of military encounters with the Crusaders as he fought them at the city of Ascalon. But as a diplomat, he also traveled to Crusader states and had quite warm relations with some of its leaders.
Okay.
Ibn Munkid was said to be impressed with their courts and liked that they were not fully autocratic. Ibn Jubayr was arguably the Muslim chronicler with the most animosity and contempt for the Crusaders. Being born in Muslim Spain and experiencing a slow decline of the Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula probably predisposed him to a negative attitude towards Christian Europe.
Makes sense.
He traveled through the Levant on his way to pilgrimage to Mecca at the end of the 12th century.
See, whoops, I just muted it by accident. Let's go back a couple seconds. I love that they gave us that note about his life, his personal life, because, you know, when we're looking at the different viewpoints of people, different sources, people who have written different accounts, I think often we forget to look at their background, the context within which they were writing, and just their life, because all of these sources that we read, they were all written by people. And so, you know, they all have these personal biases, both on a broader level, like the biases of Muslims versus Christian Europeans, but also individual biases that are influenced by their lived experience. And I really like that they noted that, because that will really help us understand his perspective on Europe and, you know, what he's going to write about Europe, because we know that, you know, he saw the decline of Muslim civilization in Spain and sort of slowly moved east. That really gives us some insight.
The Levant on his way to pilgrimage to Mecca at the end of the 12th century, and the Christian occupation made a huge negative impression on him. Ibn Jubayr met refugees from Palestine and northern Syria who left the lands captured by the Crusaders and understandably carried a lot of resentment and anger towards the foreign invaders.
Of course.
Ibn Jubayr was unhappy with Muslims who decided to continue living in the occupied lands alongside the Christian invaders. He argued that there is no excuse before God for a Muslim to remain in a city of unbelief, unless he is merely passing through. In the land of Islam, he finds shelter from the discomforts and evils to which he is subjected in the countries of the Christians, as for example, when he hears disgusting words spoken about the Prophet, particularly by the most besotted, or finds it impossible to cleanse himself properly, or has to live among pigs, and so many other illicit things. Beware of entering their lands. You must seek God's pardon and mercy for such an error.
And like I said, his perspective is quite harsh, but we can understand where that perspective comes from his experience. He definitely has more of a zealous view of religion, talking about how, if you're a Muslim living in Christian lands, what are you doing? You should get out. You have to ask for mercy. Obviously, that's very important to him. I would say, it's maybe not that easy. Sometimes you just live where you live and you got to deal with it. But like I said, we sort of understand where that harsh perspective comes from, where that zealous nature comes from, his experiences.
Apparently, the occupation of Jerusalem and many other lands in the Levant failed to cause that much resentment and mobilization in the fragmented Muslim world, apart from the refugee communities. Ibn Jubayr tried to change this situation and did his utmost to rally the Muslims against the occupation. Another important Muslim chronicler of the period.
Yeah, a quick note on that. As we've seen, in fact, in this series, sometimes we think about, the clash of civilizations, East versus West, Muslim versus Christian, but more often than not, it was Christian versus Christian, Muslim versus Muslim. There's a lot of divides within those civilizations. You have Eastern Christians versus Western Christians, aka, Catholic versus Orthodox. That split is developing. You have Sunni versus Shia Muslims. And more so, even within the same religion or the same branch of a religion, you've got different groups. In Europe, you've got a bunch of different kingdoms. You've got Western Christians fighting each other all the time, neighbors fighting each other. So, it's often brother against brother, more often than it is, Muslim versus Christian, or, these different groups versus each other. There's a lot of infighting.
Ibn al-Athir is mostly known for his monumental work, Al-Kamil fi al-Tariq, The Consummate History. He is among the chroniclers who argued that the Christian aggression against the Islamic world started earlier, when Toledo and other cities of Islamic Spain, along with Sicily, were taken by the Christian Europeans. Considered a chief Muslim historian of the crusading period, Ibn al-Athir used his platform to call the Muslims to mobilize and end the occupation of the Levant. He wrote about the fear which grappled the Muslim communities of cities under attack by the Crusaders, along with overemphasizing the Muslim successes in repelling the Crusader aggression, while underplaying Muslim defeats, arguably in attempts to raise Muslim morale for mobilization against the infidels. One of the contemporaries of the latter Crusade period was Abu al-Fida, a participant in the sieges of Tripoli and Acre. He presented accurate facts about atrocities committed by both sides. Namely, he talked about the massacre of the male population of Acre by the Muslim army following the siege, and its women and children being sold into slavery. He described the ultimate decline of the Crusader states following the defeat at Acre, amidst the despair and loss of morale by the Franks. In general, we can trace a trend of Muslim attitudes towards the Crusaders throughout the crusading period. While at first there was more curiosity towards the Crusaders rather than anger, continued occupation and massacre of the Muslim population, such as in Ma'ara, started to change the attitude towards hostility. Gradually, the calls for Muslims to unite and expel the foreign invaders and cease any kind of cooperation started to increase.
That's interesting. I think it's particularly interesting that the hostility was perhaps lower at the beginning Though it makes a lot of sense that through continued occupation and the atrocities that were committed against innocent Muslims, that resentment would build towards the Crusaders. And like I said, oftentimes there's a lot of infighting within these religious groups, but perhaps the best way to get over infighting and internal squabble is to have an external enemy. And so the Crusaders, with this occupation, would represent that external enemy, and I'm sure it would be a lot easier to unite Muslims who may otherwise fight each other. So that's interesting. And like I said, it's definitely interesting that the hostility was lower at the beginning. Because, you might think that perhaps it was sort of instant resentment and hostility, but in fact it sort of rose over time.
The impact of the Crusades in the Muslim world is still felt. While for the Christian West, the crusading period is merely an important and curious part of their history, which does not really have much to do with their modern lives. For many Muslims, it's seen as just an early episode of Western aggression, which is still going on today. Some Muslim politicians and opinion leaders still refer to the perceived modern Western attacks on the Islamic world as a continuation of the Crusades.
So that is fascinating to draw that parallel, because, and like I said, we're looking at different perspectives. So I suppose I could understand that perspective, but from how I view it, it's a very curious thing to say, because, you're drawing a direct line from the Crusades to sort of modern Western aggression against the Middle East, whereas, I just don't necessarily see that direct connection, the Europe, the Western world of today is not necessarily driven by religion. There's just, in the Western world at least, the religious aspect plays just much less of a role nowadays. But I know that in a lot of Muslim countries, a lot of them are still theocracies. Religion plays a big role in politics and daily life. So it's definitely fascinating to draw that direct line. But I would definitely sort of separate those two things. I think, the medieval Crusades are very different to modern wars in the Middle East and modern Western colonialism in the Middle East. Perhaps both were driven by some sense of expansion or wanting to claim territory, but, I don't think they have too much in common aside from that, But that's definitely interesting, and I could definitely see how it could be presented that way, particularly from a Muslim perspective.
Once again, thanks to Established Titles for sponsoring this video.
Okay, I think we are done. All right, yeah, that was an interesting video. Definitely at the end gave me something to think about with how it still impacts us to today, our politics today. And like I said, it's interesting getting a look at another perspective on history. And it's important, because you can't just rely on, the stuff we hear in our culture or, one view of events. We have to sort of look far and wide, look at history through different lenses, and take what we can. And I like that, that video is sort of seeking to do this. And like I said, the next video is from the Byzantine perspective, so I'm really fascinated with what exactly that's going to be about. I think I have an inkling, but I'm curious to see. I enjoyed this one. If you guys liked the reaction, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.